The German gunner's hands were steady as he centered the crosshairs on the lumbering British tank, crawling across the French countryside. May 1940. The Wehrmacht had been steamrolling through France for 11 days, crushing everything in its path. Another Allied tank wasn't going to change that. He squeezed the trigger. The 37mm armor-piercing round screamed toward its target at over 760 meters per second. Then it bounced off, not penetrated and failed. Bounced. The shell ricocheted skyward like a stone skipping across water, leaving nothing but a bright scar on the tank's hull. The British tank didn't even slow down. It kept grinding forward at its painfully slow 11 kilometers per hour, turret rotating with methodical precision toward the German position. The gunner fired again and again. Same result. Bright flashes, metallic clangs, shells spinning off into the French soil. His loader was feeding rounds as fast as humanly possible now, brass casings piling up around their boots. Nothing. The Matilda II, because that's what the British called this mobile fortress, absorbed everything they threw at it. Its 78mm frontal armor might as well have been made of some alien metal, for all the good their standard anti-tank weapons were doing. This wasn't supposed to happen. The panzer crews had spent the past week and a half laughing at British and French tanks. They'd knocked out Char B-1 bis, shredded through Saumur, turned hot light tanks into burning scrap. The Panzerkampfwagen and the III and I-4 had proven themselves the masters of armored warfare. German tactical doctrine, German training, German engineering, all superior. The French campaign had been a victory lap, really, a demonstration of what modern mechanized warfare looked like when executed by professionals. But nobody had told them about these particular British tanks. Intelligence reports had mentioned Matilda, sure, but the descriptions were almost dismissive. Slow, undergunned. The British infantry tank concept seemed absurdly outdated. Who designs a tank that can barely outpace a jogging soldier? The name itself sounded like a joke. Matilda, like a plump housewife, not a weapon of war. Some German crews had actually nicknamed them cardboard tanks based on early reconnaissance reports. Assuming anything that slow must be poorly armored to keep the weight down. The gunner was no longer steady. Panic crept into his movements as the Matilda's 2-pounder gun swung in his direction. Around him, other crews were experiencing the same horrifying revelation. Their 37mm PK-36 anti-tank guns, the standard supposedly reliable tank killer of the Wehrmacht, were useless. Completely, utterly useless. They might as well have been throwing rocks. The mathematical reality was brutal. Their shells delivered roughly 40 millimeters of penetration at best. The Matilda's armor was nearly double that thickness. Simple arithmetic, but arithmetic that could get you killed. What the German crews didn't know, what nobody outside a few British military circles knew, was that they were facing the most heavily armored tank in the world at that moment. Not just thick armor, but properly designed, well-angled protection that had been the product of hard lessons and careful engineering. The Matilda II's armor scheme wasn't an accident or oversight. It was deliberate, intentional. The British had built a tank specifically to laugh at the kind of weapons now hammering uselessly against its hide. And as that realization spread through the German positions near Arras, something shifted. The invincible Wehrmacht, the unstoppable Blitzkrieg, had just met something it couldn't stop. To understand how the British ended up building a tank that could shrug off German fire, we need to rewind 2 decades. November 1918. The Great War had just ended, and military theorists across Europe were trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Tanks had made their debut at the Somme in September 1916, lumbering mechanical monsters that terrified German infantry, but broke down almost as often as they broke through. By war's end, they'd proven themselves capable of cracking trench lines, but nobody quite agreed on what they'd actually proven. The debate that followed would shape the next war entirely. Were tanks breakthrough weapons meant to exploit gaps and race into enemy rear areas? Or were they mobile bunkers designed to shield infantry as they advanced across killing fields? 2 schools of thought emerged, and Britain, somewhat uniquely, decided the answer was both. J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart, 2 of Britain's most influential military theorists, championed fast-ranging armored formations. They'd seen how tanks could restore mobility to warfare, how properly deployed armor could bypass strong points and create chaos in enemy logistics. Fuller's Plan 1919, never executed because the war ended, envisioned masses of medium tanks driving deep into German territory, paralyzing command structures. This thinking would eventually birth the cruiser tank concept, fast, moderately armored, designed for sweeping maneuvers. But there was another problem that needed solving. The infantry still had to advance. They still had to take and hold ground. And when they did, they'd face the same machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and field guns that had turned no man's land into an abattoir. What they needed was something that could crawl forward at walking pace, absorb punishment, and suppress enemy positions while soldiers moved behind it. Not a cavalry tank, an infantry tank. This wasn't a fringe idea. In 1934, the British War Office issued a specification for exactly this kind of vehicle. They wanted protection above all else. Speed optional, range negotiable. The tank needed to survive concentrated small arms fire, resist anti-tank rifles, and ideally shrug off field artillery. It needed to be cheap enough to produce in quantity, and simple enough that conscript crews could operate it. The British designated it the Infantry Tank Mark I, but everyone called it Matilda, allegedly because its shape reminded someone of a waddling cartoon duck from a contemporary comic strip. The Matilda I was rushed into production in 1938 as war clouds gathered. It had magnificent armor for its weight, 60 millimeters, but only a single machine gun for armament. Still, it proved the concept. When the improved Matilda II entered service in 1939, British engineers had refined the formula. They'd increased the armor to 78 millimeters on the front, added a proper turret with a 2-pounder anti-tank gun, and created something genuinely formidable. The cost? A top speed of just 15 miles per hour and appalling mechanical complexity. The Matilda II used 2 bus engines because no single power plant could move its 27 tons reliably. Meanwhile, Germany had gone a different direction entirely. Their tanks prioritized balanced characteristics: decent armor, reasonable speed, adequate firepower. The Panzer III carried 30 millimeters of frontal armor. The Panzer IV slightly more. They were built for maneuver warfare, for the combined arms tactics that would become Blitzkrieg. German doctrine didn't envision slugging matches between heavily armored opponents. They planned to avoid enemy strength, exploit weakness, and move too quickly for defenders to react. Neither side fully understood what the other had built, and that misunderstanding was about to become very, very expensive. The Matilda Series II that rolled off production lines at Vulcan Foundry in Warrington was an engineering compromise that somehow became a masterpiece. When chief designer John Carden's team at Woolwich Arsenal began work in 1936, they faced a seemingly impossible brief. Create a tank with armor thick enough to resist every anti-tank weapon then in service, keep it cheap enough for mass production, and make it mobile enough to accompany infantry. The laws of physics suggested you could have 2 of those 3. Carden's team delivered all 3, though the solution was far from elegant. The armor scheme was the heart of everything. The Matilda II's frontal protection ranged from 75 to 78 millimeters. Absolutely extraordinary for 1939. To put that in context, the French Char B1 bis, considered heavily armored, maxed out at 60 millimeters. Germany's heaviest production tank, the Panzer IV, carried just 30 millimeters up front. The Matilda's side armor was 65 to 70 millimeters. Even the rear had 55 millimeters. This wasn't a tank with a strong front and weak flanks. It was a steel pillbox on tracks. Achieving this meant accepting brutal compromises elsewhere. The hull was cast and riveted in sections, a manufacturing technique that allowed for thick armor but limited production speed. Each tank required roughly 16,000 man-hours to complete. Vulcan Foundry, which produced the majority of Matildas, could manage perhaps 5 tanks per week at peak production. Compare that to German factories churning out dozens of Panzer IIIs monthly. Britain had quality, but Germany had quantity. The power plant solution bordered on absurd. No single engine available could reliably move 27 tons of armor at any reasonable speed. So the designers fitted 2 AEC diesel engines originally designed for London buses, running side by side. Each produced 87 horsepower. Combined, they gave the Matilda a theoretical 174 horsepower, though mechanical losses meant actual output was lower. The power-to-weight ratio was atrocious, roughly 6.4 horsepower per ton. A Panzer III managed nearly double that. The twin-engine arrangement made maintenance a nightmare. Mechanics essentially had to service two separate power plants, and if one failed, the tank was immobilized. The 2-pounder gun seemed adequate. In 1939, it fired a 40mm, armor-piercing round capable of penetrating roughly 50 to 60 millimeters of armor at combat ranges against the thin-skinned panzers of 1940. It was perfectly viable. The problem was what the 2-pounder couldn't do. It had no high-explosive round. British doctrine assumed tanks would fight tanks whilst infantry dealt with anti-tank guns. The Matilda could kill enemy armor beautifully, but was helpless against fortified positions or infantry in buildings. Crews would discover this limitation the hard way. Inside, the 4-man crew worked in cramped, sweltering conditions. The commander sat in the turret alongside the gunner, attempting to direct the tank, coordinate with other vehicles, and command the gun simultaneously. Below in the hull, the driver wrestled with a Wilson epicyclic gearbox, a robust but complex system requiring careful coordination. The hull gunner, often feeling rather useless given the limited traverse of his machine gun, mostly served as a second pair of eyes and an extra body for maintenance duties. The suspension was another Carden innovation, a scissors-type arrangement with helical springs that gave a surprisingly smooth ride despite the tank's weight. 10 small road wheels per side distributed the load effectively, and the track links were robust cast manganese steel. This mattered more than it sounds. Tracks were the Achilles heel of many early war tanks, snapping under stress or shedding in turns. By September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, only 2 Matilda IIs had been delivered to the army. Production was ramping up, but slowly. By May 1940, roughly 100 were available, not nearly enough to equip armored divisions properly, but enough to form the core of the 1st Army Tank Brigade. Those 100 tanks were about to punch well above their weight. Those 100 Matildas crossed the Channel into a catastrophe already well underway. On 10th May 1940, German forces had launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. What followed was a masterclass in mobile warfare that shattered every assumption about how modern war would be fought. Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps punched through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse at Sedan on 13th May, and simply kept going. The French and British expected a replay of 1914, a grinding attritional struggle along fortified lines. Instead, they got a lightning war that moved faster than their command structure could process. By 20th May, German armored spearheads had reached the English Channel at Abbeville. In 10 days, they'd driven nearly 400 kilometers through supposedly impassable terrain, cut the Allied armies in two, and trapped the British Expeditionary Force against the coast. It wasn't just victory, it was humiliation. French generals issued orders to divisions that had already been encircled. British commanders received intelligence reports describing German positions that were already 50 kilometers further west. The speed of the German advance made conventional military thinking obsolete. And the tanks, the bloody tanks, were everywhere. Panzer divisions didn't attack like traditional armored formations. They bypassed strong points, ignored their flanks, and raced for strategic objectives deep in the rear. French Char B-1 bis tanks were individually superior to anything Germany fielded, but they sat defending river crossings, whilst German columns drove past them on roads 15 kilometers away. Superior armor meant nothing if you were in the wrong place. German tank crews had spent 2 weeks demolishing Allied armor piecemeal. They'd learned that French tanks, whilst individually formidable, operated in small packets without proper infantry or artillery support. British light tanks and cruiser tanks were faster, but carried armor you could penetrate with a decent anti-tank rifle. The Panzer III's 37mm gun and the Panzerfreu's short 75mm howitzer had proven entirely adequate against everything they'd encountered. More importantly, German crews fought as combined arms teams. When they met resistance, they didn't charge in alone. They called up infantry, artillery, and Luftwaffe support. Tanks were shock weapons, breakthrough weapons, but never sacrificial weapons. This success bred a particular kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Why wouldn't it? They'd accomplished in days what the Kaiser's armies couldn't manage in 4 years. German tactical radios meant their tanks could coordinate movements that would have been impossible for Allied forces, still relying on flag signals and carrier pigeons in some units. Every encounter seemed to validate their training, their doctrine, their equipment. The occasional tough fight, like the brutal combat at Hanot, where French Somois gave better than they got, only proved that aggressive tactics and combined arms could overcome local disadvantages. By the third week of May, the strategic picture was clear. The BF was retreating towards Dunkirk. French forces were disintegrating. The campaign was essentially won. German intelligence had identified British tank units in the area, but nothing in their briefings suggested serious concern. They'd faced British armor before. Light tanks with machine guns, cruiser tanks with thin protection, fast perhaps, but nothing that required special measures. Standard PK-36 anti-tank guns would suffice. What intelligence hadn't told them? What they had no reason to suspect was that a chunk of Britain's Army Tank Brigade was sitting at Arras with something German doctrine hadn't accounted for. The 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments had taken delivery of their Matildas just weeks before the invasion. Many crews were still learning the quirks of their twin-engine charges. But on 21st of May, they were going to get a very practical education. So were the Germans. The counterattack at Arras on 21st May wasn't meant to be a decisive battle. It was meant to be a spoiling attack, a jab to slow the German advance and buy time for evacuation planning. Major General Harold Franklin commanded 2 columns, one built around the 4th Royal Tank Regiment, with 16 Matilda IIs and 42 Matilda Is, the other around the 7th Royal Tank Regiment with 23 Matilda IIs. Supporting them were 2 infantry battalions, some French light tanks, and precious little else. No proper reconnaissance, no air support. The RAF was already evacuating from forward bases. No clear picture of what they were attacking into. Just orders to strike south from Arras and see what happened. What happened was they drove straight into Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. Rommel had been pushing his division hard, living up to his reputation for aggressive leadership. His units were strung out along the advance. Tanks and motorized infantry intermixed with supply trucks and captured French vehicles pressed into service. The division had been moving fast and fighting light. Exactly the kind of fluid mobile warfare that made Blitzkrieg work. Around 1430 hours, as Rommel's forces were regrouping west of Arras, British tanks appeared on their flanks. The German response was textbook. Anti-tank gun crews swung their PK-36s into position and opened fire, then confusion, then panic. The 37 rounds were bouncing off. Crews who'd spent 2 weeks knocking out Allied tanks with casual efficiency suddenly found themselves hammering away at British armor that refused to die. One Matilda reportedly took 14 direct hits and kept coming. Another absorbed rounds from multiple guns simultaneously, shrugging them off whilst methodically destroying the German positions with its 2-pounder. Rommel's artillery, the divisional 105mm howitzers, tried engaging directly. Field guns designed for indirect fire found themselves pressed into point-blank anti-tank work. Some crews managed to disable Matildas with lucky hits to tracks or suspension. But it was desperate, improvised fighting. The German infantry, watching their anti-tank guns fail completely, began falling back. In some areas, that fallback turned into rout. Supply columns abandoned trucks and fled. The 7th Panzer Division's war diary, normally confident, records the afternoon as heavy British tank attack that created critical situation. The British punched through the German screen and into the soft logistics tail. Matildas crushed artillery positions, overran supply dumps, and scattered infantry battalions. German crews abandoned their PK-36 as useless tin openers. They'd already started calling them door knockers after encounters with heavy French tanks. The 2-pounder guns on the Matildas, whilst lacking high explosive rounds, were perfectly adequate for destroying the Panzer II and light vehicles that made up much of Rommel's screen. At one point, elements of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment were 6 kilometers behind the initial German positions, but the attack was too small and too unsupported to exploit the breakthrough. The Matildas, armed only with machine guns, contributed little beyond their armor. The infantry couldn't keep pace with the tanks and got pinned down. French light tanks that were supposed to protect the British flanks got separated or knocked out by German fire. Most critically, the British had no follow-up force. This was a raid, not an offensive. As German forces recovered from the initial shock and began pulling together a coherent defense, the physics of the situation reasserted themselves. Rommel himself grabbed every gun that could hurt the British tanks. He personally directed 105mm howitzers, and even commandeered a battery of 88mm anti-aircraft guns, massive weapons designed to swat bombers out of the sky. These could punch through Matilda armor, though setting up the unwieldy guns under fire cost the crews dearly. By evening, the British were withdrawing, having lost roughly half their tanks to mechanical breakdown, track damage, or the few heavy German weapons that could harm them. But the damage, psychological more than tactical, was done. The Wehrmacht had spent an afternoon watching its standard anti-tank weapons fail completely. The Matildas that impressed Rommel at Arras were just the appetizer. The main course came in the western desert, where the combination of open terrain, inferior opposition, and concentrated deployment turned the infantry tank into an absolute nightmare for the Axis. When Italy declared war in June 1940, Mussolini's forces in Libya vastly outnumbered the British and Commonwealth troops defending Egypt. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani commanded roughly 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks. The British Western Desert Force under General Richard O'Connor scraped together perhaps 36,000 troops. On paper, it looked like a massacre waiting to happen. In September, Italian forces pushed cautiously into Egypt and established fortified camps at Sidi Barrani. Then they stopped, waiting for supplies and reinforcements. That pause was fatal. O'Connor planned Operation Compass, originally conceived as a large-scale raid to bloody the Italians and withdraw. He had roughly 50 Matilda IIs from the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. On 9th December 1940, those 50 tanks led the assault on the Italian camps at Nibewa and Tumur. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration of what happens when you bring a knife to a gunfight. Except the Italians were the ones with knives. Italian anti-tank guns were predominantly 47mm Breda models, adequate against light armor, useless against Matildas. The Italian M1139 and M1340 tanks carried armor between 30 and 42mm at best. Their guns could barely scratch the British tanks whilst the 2-pounders punched through Italian armor like cardboard. One Matilda commander reported engaging 17 Italian tanks in succession, knocking out every single one without receiving damage. Another Matilda took over 50 anti-tank hits during the battle and drove away under its own power. The psychological effect on Italian troops was devastating. When Matildas appeared on the horizon, entire battalions surrendered rather than face them. At Sidi Barrani, 237 Italian tanks were abandoned or destroyed. Over 38,000 Italian soldiers surrendered. The 5-day battle that was supposed to be a raid turned into the collapse of Graziani's entire position in Egypt. O'Connor didn't stop. He kept pushing west into Libya. Bardia fell on 5th January 1941. Tobruk on 22nd January. At Beit Afam in February, O'Connor's forces, including the indomitable Matildas, cut off the retreating Italian 10th Army and forced its complete surrender. In 2 months, the Western Desert Force advanced 800 kilometers, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, captured 130,000 prisoners, and knocked out or captured over 400 tanks. British losses? Roughly 500 dead and 1,400 wounded. It remains one of the most lopsided campaigns in modern military history. The Matildas were at the spearhead of everything. Their immunity to Italian anti-tank fire meant they could advance with impunity, suppress defensive positions, and break Italian morale simply by appearing. Crews became cocky. Why wouldn't they? Some painted nicknames on their tanks. Cleopatra, Desperate, Dreadnought. They'd earned the swagger. Desert terrain suited the Matilda's limitations. Slow speed mattered less in open ground where sightlines stretched for kilometers. The lack of high explosive ammunition was less critical when enemy infantry fled at the first sight of them. But Germany was watching and learning. Rommel arrived in North Africa in February 1941 with explicit orders to study British armor and develop counters. He'd already fought Matildas at Arras. He knew what standard weapons couldn't do to them. When he deployed the Afrika Korps into Libya in March, his supply requests had a very specific item at the top: 88mm anti-aircraft guns. Lots of them. The 88mm flak gun wasn't designed to kill tanks. It was designed to swat Luftwaffe enemies out of the sky at 8,000 meters altitude. The Flak 18, to give it its full gloriously German designation, was arguably the finest anti-aircraft weapon in the world. When it entered service in 1933, it fired an 88mm shell weighing 9 kilograms at a muzzle, velocity of 820 meters per second. The high velocity meant flat trajectory and excellent accuracy. The heavy shell meant devastating kinetic energy. Against bombers, it was superb. Against tanks, it was grotesque overkill. But overkill was exactly what you needed against a Matilda. Rommel had learned the lesson at Arras. When standard anti-tank guns failed, he'd commandeered his 80mm flak batteries and watched them punch straight through British armor. The memory stuck. When the Africa Corps deployed to Libya, Rommel ensured his divisions included substantial flak assets, officially for air defense, but with ammunition loads that suggested other intentions. His staff officers understood immediately. The 88 could engage aircraft at extreme altitude or tank armor at extreme range. Versatility delivered with cold steel precision. The first major test came during Operation Brevity in May 1941, when British forces attempted to push Rommel back from the Egyptian frontier. At Halfaya Pass, soon to be nicknamed Hellfire Pass, German forces dug in their 88s with murderous cunning. They positioned the guns in hull-down positions with clear fields of fire, camouflaged them meticulously, and waited. When British Matildas advanced on 15th May, the 88s opened fire at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Matildas that had been immune to every Italian and German weapon suddenly exploded or stopped dead. Turrets blown clean off. Crews who'd felt invincible for months discovered what it felt like to face something that could actually kill them. The 88 could penetrate roughly 100 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. The Matilda's 78 millimeters might as well have been tissue paper at those ranges. British crews reported seeing the muzzle flash and being hit almost simultaneously. The shell velocity was so high there was no time to react. One moment you're advancing confidently, the next your tank is a fireball. The psychological whiplash was severe. Tankers who'd grown accustomed to invulnerability suddenly faced a weapon that made their armor meaningless. But employing 88s as anti-tank guns came with brutal compromises. The weapon was massive. It weighed over 5 tons in traveling configuration. Setting it up required a crew of 10 and several minutes of vulnerable exposure. The gun sat on a cruciform platform that offered no protection whatsoever. Unlike a PaK-36 or even a PaK-38, which had shields and could be concealed in small depressions, the 88 was enormous and conspicuous. Crews operating them in the anti-tank role were horribly exposed. British artillery and infantry could slaughter 88 crews if they spotted them before the tanks did. The ammunition situation was equally problematic. Every 88-meter shell used against tanks was one fewer shell available for air defense. North Africa's supply situation was precarious. Everything had to cross the Mediterranean under Royal Navy and RAF harassment. Rommel was perpetually short of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Using premium anti-aircraft ammunition to kill tanks was strategically questionable, however tactically necessary. Yet it worked. By mid-1941, German doctrine had adapted. Commanders learned to deploy 88s in ambush positions where Matildas would advance into prepared killing grounds. They'd let British tanks bypass forward positions, then engage from the flanks at long range where the Matilda's slow speed prevented effective response. The tactic was effective but resource-intensive. You needed intelligence, terrain knowledge, disciplined crews willing to hold fire until the perfect moment, and enough 88s to make the ambush decisive. The Matilda's reign of invincibility was over. But the solution had cost Germany dearly in tactical flexibility and resources. The Matilda's shock value fundamentally altered how every nation thought about tank design. Before Arras and the Western Desert, armor thickness was a secondary consideration, something you balanced against speed, cost, and firepower. After watching supposedly invincible panzers flee from slow British tanks, that calculus changed overnight. Protection wasn't just useful, it was survival. And if your opponent fielded tanks your weapons couldn't penetrate, you didn't have tanks, you had mobile coffins. Germany responded with characteristic urgency. In late 1940, orders went out to up-armor everything. The Panzer III, backbone of the armored divisions, received a 50mm gun to replace its inadequate 37mm pop gun. Frontal armor increased from 30mm to 50mm, then eventually to 70mm with applique plates bolted on in the field. The Panzer IV, originally designed as an infantry support tank with a short howitzer, was retrofitted with a long-barreled 75mm gun that could engage enemy armor at serious ranges. By 1942, this gun could penetrate 90mm of armor at 1,000 meters, more than enough to kill a Matilda. But Germany didn't stop there. The Matilda experience, combined with encounters with the Soviet KV-1 heavy tank in Russia, convinced German high command that they'd fundamentally misjudged the armor race. Development accelerated on the Panzer IV Panther and Panzer VI Tiger tanks that carried 80 to 100 millimeters of frontal armor and guns capable of destroying anything on tracks. The Tiger I, entering service in late 1942, mounted an 88mm gun in a rotating turret with armor up to 120 millimeters thick. It was a direct response to tanks like the Matilda and KV-1 that had humiliated German gunners. Britain learned different lessons. The Matilda had proven the infantry tank concept, but also exposed its limitations. By 1941, the lack of high-explosive ammunition and the mechanical unreliability from those twin bus engines had become critical problems. More fundamentally, the desert campaigns revealed that speed mattered more than British doctrine had assumed. Rommel's Africa Corps didn't sit still and absorb punishment. They maneuvered, flanked, and dictated engagement ranges. A tank that could only do 15 miles per hour couldn't pursue defeated enemies or escape bad tactical situations. The Churchill tank, entering service in 1941, retained heavy armor but added a high-explosive firing 75mm gun and better mobility. By 1942, Britain was shifting towards universal tanks, designs that combined reasonable protection with decent speed and proper, multi-purpose armament. The Matilda soldiered on in secondary theaters, particularly the Pacific, where Japanese anti-tank weapons were even weaker than Italian ones. Australian crews used Matildas effectively through 1945 in New Guinea and Borneo, proving that context matters as much as capability. The Americans, watching from across the Atlantic, drew their own conclusions. The Sherman tank, that would eventually dominate Allied production, emphasized reliability, ease of manufacture, and good enough protection rather than invincibility. American doctrine assumed they'd lose the one-on-one tank battles, but win through numbers, logistics, and combined arms. They weren't entirely wrong. The Sherman's weaknesses are well documented, but 50,000 of them proved more valuable than a handful of invincible but complex heavy tanks. By 1943, the Matilda was obsolete. German guns could penetrate it easily. Its speed was intolerable in fluid warfare. Production had ceased in August 1943 after roughly 2,900 units, but its legacy lived on. In every tank design meeting where engineers debated armor thickness, in every doctrine paper discussing protection versus mobility, and in the psychological scars it left on a generation of Wehrmacht veterans who'd watched their shells bounce off like rubber balls the British had built, a tank that laughed at its enemies, right up until they learned to stop laughing back.